quote if you wish, because I have nothing to lose, but I don't guarantee to be an expert on Pope Francis, still less on Argentina, but there may be people here who can answer the questions if I can't. But you can either ask questions or make comments, or indeed totally disagree with what I said if you wish. Feel completely free. Before we do that, let me, because she may disappear, let me express our sincere thanks to Bernadette for the lovely soup. Excellent wine and cheese. Thank you very much, Bernadette. Please, feel free.
Can I start with the aspect of the poor? Because it does seem that there's an emphasis on the poor to the exclusion of anybody who's got anything other than being poor. And that there's a sort of feeling that perhaps the Pope is only looking at one section of the Church.
That's very good. Let me read, because I just was reading, I remember this, it's a very good question, I don't know if you all heard it. The Pope seems to be concentrating on the poor to the exclusions of others. This is the beginning of chapter 8 of Austin's biography. To find critics of Cardinal Bergoglio, it helps to go north from Avenida Rivadavia to the Barrio Norte, this is in Buenos Aires. And he goes on, basically, this is a barrio full of quite wealthy people, bankers and middle-class people. And people complained there that he hardly ever came to parish functions or dinners when he was Archbishop. When he did, he couldn't get away fast enough, saying his brain didn't work very well after 9 p.m. That's good. I don't know if he didn't feel comfortable there, but he didn't see it as a priority. He showed, according to a priest, he showed no interest at all in the middle-class world of Catholics, not the world of business or banking or the arts or university. I think what certainly came clear to me from this biography is that right from his earliest days as a Jesuit, he was a Jesuit provincial virtually as soon as he was a fully fledged Jesuit, there was this emphasis on reaching out to what he would call the periphery or the margin. He believes that this is where the Church finds energy. There's a whole kind of understanding here, I think, that he sees the Church in Europe as tired and rather depressed, and the Church will find energy through what the South American experience of reaching out to the poor, not in a political sense. He's always resisted any alignment with Marxism or left-wing ideology, or for that matter, of course, right-wing ideology. He believes that in what he calls the holy people of God, the ordinary, often rather poor and downtrodden people, that's where you find the real life of the Church, in their devotions, in their deep and in their sufferings, and that if the Church reaches out to these people, it will regain energy. Now that is his point of view. It's a point of view that obviously is very coherent. You often find this kind of approach in people who come from quite a privileged background themselves. Father Michael Hollings, who was your parish priest here for well over 20 years, who came from a very upper-class background, led an extremely simple life himself, and spent, I suppose, most of his time reaching out to people, again, who he would have considered to be on the margins, homeless, people who beat a track to his door for spiritual direction because they didn't find any other priest who could make sense to them. And he gained great energy from that. But again, probably here, I guess there were people who complained, well, you know, he's more interested in the poor than he is in the rich. The rich have souls too, one might say. I think this is who he is. It's what gives him energy, and there are, I suppose, all he would say is, well, no one is perfect, no one can do everything. But I think it's a good understanding. It does lead some people to feel, yes, that he's criticising them. I know priests who have said to me, oh, I feel he's always like telling us off. I mean, I joked with one bishop when, shortly after Francis had became Pope, I said, "Oh, I suppose you'll be moving out of your big apartment." I said, "You're a fine one to talk living out of that." But I think that's very much who he is, yeah. And he believes, it's not just a personal choice, I think he believes that the church will be revitalised through reaching out to the poor. Not just the poor, but he has this interesting phrase, the physical and the existential margins of periphery, by which he means the physically poor, but also people who may be distant. I think that's why he's interested in reaching out to divorced and remarried people. I mean, they may be well-to-do people, but in terms of the church, or gay people, in terms of the church, he would see these as people who are potentially rather marginalised, who feel the church perhaps disapproves of them. And his approach is, no, don't disapprove of these people, move out and connect with them. That's what you have to do.
That's similar to Jesus, though, isn't it?
Well, if I can...
It's easier for a rich man to go to a fire than evil.
It is true. It's amazing when you listen to Pope Francis and read the Gospels. It dawns on you that Jesus actually talks about the poor quite a lot. There's a lovely quotation in here which really struck me. I don't know if I can find it. About his first, one of his first masses. I think it was the first Mass he said as a... I'm probably not going to find it, I'm going to spend a lot of time. Oh, here it is, yes. What is this? His inauguration Mass, March the 19th, 2 years ago. Nearly coming up to the second anniversary, aren't we? Blah, blah, blah. As he had done in... Francis' theme was St. Joseph's protective tender leadership. It's held on March the 19th. Here's a quotation from him. "Let us never forget that authentic power is service, and that the Pope too, when exercising power, must enter ever more fully into that service which has its radiant culmination on the cross. He must be inspired by the lowly, concrete and faithful service. Mark St. Joseph, and like him, he must open his arms to protect all of God's people and embrace with tender affection the whole of humanity, especially the poorest, the weakest, the least important, those whom Matthew lists in the final judgment on love, the hungry, the thirsty, the stranger, the naked, the sick, and those in prison. Only those who serve with love are able to protect." End of quotation. Now, there's a lovely little exchange reported in here. I presume it comes directly from the people concerned. There are two very senior cardinals listening to this or celebrating. Cardinal Schönborn of Vienna, Cardinal Christoph Schönborn, who says he was in tears throughout the homily. He turned to his neighbour, who was Cardinal Timothy Dolan, the Archbishop of New York. I didn't realise the cardinals addressed each other in quite this way, but he says, "Tim, he speaks like Jesus." To which Tim, Cardinal Dolan, replies, Chris, I think that's his job description." Rather wonderful exchange. Yes, I think people feel that, or as Austin Ivory says somewhere again, I can't quite sure that I can. He says that in a sense, he quotes various media reports on him. The Financial Times noted, "Francis has a sincerity and authenticity that no world leader can match." What had captivated the world, says Austin Ivory, though few dared put it as plainly as Cardinal Schönborn did in that quotation, was that Francis' actions, words and gestures had awoken in Western culture a dim, often unconscious yet powerful memory of someone once loved but since lost. In other words, of Jesus himself. There is this sense which, in the closing years, certainly under Pope Benedict, the sense that Western culture, as I say, the strong side of Pope Benedict's papacy was that he was able to critique Western culture brilliantly. But what did that say? It kind of left the feeling that you're always attacking the modern world for it. And there are many things you could attack, you know. You only walk out on the streets and you sense that most people you encounter are very far from God. They have very little sense of the gospel or of the church. And yet, so what they're saying about Pope Francis is that he evokes the memory of the Jesus who we have lost in our culture. He reminds people of Jesus, which is quite a powerful thing to say of someone, really.
Yes, something I didn't understand from your talk. You said that Pope Francis is trying to reach the margins, and obviously people like good divorced and people who are gay, etc., are on the margin, including the poor. But you said something about liberalism as well. I suppose you'll bring this up next week when we come. But does being liberal in the church's current attitude towards people on the margins mean that these people will be able to come into the church and be more part of the church? Is that the way it works? Because I suppose next week you'll explain what the current teaching of the church is.
Well, yes.
And what is proposed. But I'm just wondering, is that the way that he proceeds for?
I don't think you could call Pope Francis a liberal.
Right.
I mean, when you describe someone as a liberal in church matters, I suppose what it means is they're someone who either thinks that church teaching has gone down the wrong road, that it should basically be changed in doctrinal or moral matters, or that it doesn't somehow matter very much what you believe. It's generally associated with a kind of relativism which we find in today's culture, where you would say, well, there are so many different religions and point of view in society today that it's not a good idea to emphasize too strongly the distinctiveness of Catholic doctrine, or for that matter Muslim doctrine or Protestant doctrine, because if you do that you will simply increase tension and possibly violence within society. Therefore religions should renounce their claim to possess an exclusive truth, and they should be much more tolerant. Intellectually, I think it's quite difficult to reconcile that with a belief in Jesus Christ as the revealer of God, and as the church as the one continuing his. It's very difficult, I think, to really believe that, and at the same time to say that it doesn't really matter too much what you believe or how you behave. I don't think in any sense that Pope Francis is that kind of an animal.
The other question is, why is he concentrating on the family? I suppose the family is very important, because even John Paul II concentrated very much on the family, even went so far as to tell the church that it was the basic building block of society. So he also gave a lot of emphasis. But why does Pope Francis see the family in a different light at the moment, whereby he had to have a particular synod on the family?
Well, I don't think he chose to have a synod on the family out of nowhere. I think a lot of these issues have been bubbling up for quite a number of years. Quite a number of cardinals had made attempts to have this put on the agenda beforehand at previous synods, but they had been brushed aside. I think I can only assume that he discerned that this was, as it were, the outstanding issue which a lot of cardinals, bishops, ordinary people are talking about, and that something had to be done. It's not to say there aren't other important issues, but synods are an invention of not the synods aren't an invention, but the modern synod is an invention of the Second Vatican Council. They were a way of continuing the work of the Council. Clearly, a council is a meeting potentially of all the bishops of the world. Clearly, you can't have that very often. It's a once in a lifetime, or once in 100 years or more event. So you continue the work of the council by synods, which bring together representative bishops. And I think the idea after the council was to hold synods every 2 years on different topics. So there've been a whole range of synods on different topics since the Second Vatican Council, and I think I can only assume that Pope Francis felt that this was the outstanding topic that needed to be addressed first.
He has first-hand experience living in Argentina as well.
Sorry?
He has first-hand experience living in Argentina, and the recognition of the fact that the family is the fabric of a nation, the fabric of the world as well.
Yes.
And it's so important, and well-versed in the peripheries as well.
He's very much a believer in the family, in society, he'd have quite a different viewpoint to the rather individualistic Protestant-orientated approach we have here, where the individual is everything. I mean, he has these principles which I think he's enunciated several times. They occur in Evangelii Gaudium, his document on evangelization. There are 4 of them, which I can't remember all of them, but one of them is the whole is greater than the parts. The time is more important than space. I haven't quite grasped what that one means. These are some of his... But, he very much believes that society is the fabric of society is the important question that's got to be addressed. Not so much the rights of the individual as we would perhaps see it over here. And that the family within that is an absolute, as you say, an absolutely key building block. He believes very much in the traditional family. He totally opposed, I don't want to anticipate my talk on homosexuality, but he completely and strongly opposed same-sex marriage when it was introduced into Argentina a few years ago. However, interestingly, he himself, and he was narrowly defeated, I think, on this by the Bishops' Conference of Argentina, he himself would have reacted positively to civil unions between homosexual people, because his argument would have been that if you oppose those, you just seem to be saying no to everything that homosexual people want. So if you say yes to that, you're not. Then when you oppose same-sex marriage, you're not seen to be completely negative. I mean, I think he genuinely believed that civil unions are a matter of justice for gay people, but he completely opposed to same-sex marriage, and on the grounds, that very traditional grounds that a child has a right to a father and a mother.
And the other question, you said that he didn't say anything about what he wanted from or his views on what the outcome of the synod would be, that he summed it up. But if that was the case, and I assume the Holy Spirit works in a synod to give a final answer, an answer was produced when they all voted. Why does he have to have another meeting this year?
I think it was always assumed, I think the process was always going to be that there were 2 synods. I don't think this synod in this year is an afterthought. I think he felt this is going to be, I think it's probably part of his thinking that he knew this would be a long and complex process. That he wasn't going to sort of make a magisterial statement, as previous popes had done at the end of the synod, and say, well, thank you all very much for your views, now I'll tell you what you said, sort of thing, or what we're going to... precisely because he does believe that the Holy Spirit is going to speak through the process, he's extended the process for a time of reflection in a sense that's part of what we're doing here now. He wants the Church to reflect on these issues, the bishops to come back, and yes, he knows obviously at the end of the next synod some sort of statements and resolution has got to be made. You can't prolong it indefinitely. Yes?
And when you were talking about his behaviour in the synod, you made some comments about the Orthodox Church, and then earlier you talked about that he'd had some links with a charismatic Protestant group. Do you think that he has some kind of interest in, kind of wider interdenominational unity, or was that just kind of a passing coincidence?
Certainly, I certainly think he does, yes. I think with the Orthodox, I mean, Pope John Paul II spoke very, and of course being Polish, he felt particularly close to the Orthodox churches, particularly of Russia and the Slavic churches. He spoke very movingly about the church needing to breathe with both its lungs. There is in reality, in theology, there is, one might almost say, a hair's breadth of difference between us and the Orthodox. It's really only the position of the Pope, certain questions possibly about whether you should celebrate the Eucharist with leavened or unleavened bread, which are hardly earth-shattering. Of course, the famous filioque, but frankly, with goodwill, that's a problem that could be solved. So that theologically, there's very little difference between us and the Orthodox. We ought to be one church. Culturally, we're miles apart. You know, he seems to have made a tremendous impression on Patriarch Bartholomew, who, according to someone I met who went to whose wedding, I think, was Patriarch Bartholomew turned up at, whether he actually celebrated, I can't remember, but Patriarch Bartholomew said to this person, I think that Pope Francis is absolutely wonderful. I'm sure that I believe in him, that he's really going to help unite the churches. Well, as soon as Patriarch Bartholomew said that, quite a few of the monks on Mount Athos stopped praying for him. It'd be the equivalent of the Carmelite nuns here in Notting Hill saying, we're not praying, sorry Father, when you come to the Mass, don't mention Pope Francis, because we're not praying for him. It's that sort of thing. I mean, as for the Russians, I mean, they are all over the place, culturally, and you know, they feel tremendously threatened by the West and by the power of the Catholic Church, which they see as a sort of Western organisation. So culturally we're miles apart. Theologically we ought to be united. I'm sure, I think that any Pope in modern times would be a major item on his agenda to achieve or to make substantial steps towards reunion with the Orthodox. Protestants are rather harder, really. I mean, with the Orthodox, what we ought to be able to achieve is substantial unity, whereby we can share the same sacraments, and they recognise the Pope as probably what he was in the early centuries of the Church, as having a sort of primacy of honour. With the Protestants, it's probably more difficult to imagine what it would look like. Maybe some form of what's sometimes called reconciled diversity might be the object. I don't know. Whether Protestants could ever recognise the Pope as some sort of unofficial leader, I don't know. But I certainly think that he would put that high on his agenda, yes.
Pope Francis, he named himself after Francis of Assisi, so he's into the caring and welfare of animals. Is that right?
I think, well, he is actually. I think he's very interested in the environment. There's a wonderful statement in one of his documents, which apparently was put on a plaque in one of these nature parks somewhere about one of these. He has an amazing ability to turn a phrase, doesn't he? He says something like, you know, through our bodies we feel, through the bodies that God has given us, we can feel the ills that the earth suffers, and something like that. A wonderful, beautiful way of putting it. So he is very interested in ecology. I think primarily he chose the name Francis to emphasise simplicity and love of the poor. And possibly also the desire to reform the church. Because Pope Francis, of course, Pope Innocent III had the great dream in which he saw this simple friar sort of holding up the church. Indeed, Francis himself had a vision of God speaking to him through the famous crucifix of San Damiano, saying, Francis, repair my church. And he thought at first it meant rebuild the actual church. But he came to realise it meant, you know, actually rebuild my church. So the name Francis speaks on different levels: simplicity, poverty, Christ-likeness, and reform of the church.
Coming back to when you were speaking about homosexual marriages and civil unions, that kind of thing. If this would preempt, if the answer would preempt what you're going to say, or you can save it for them.
I can't remember what I'm going to say, don't worry. I keep changing it anyway. So.
Yes, if the Pope was before, if he voted in favour of civil unions, and you know, throughout the Bible, sodomy has been, I mean, like categorically, there's no grey here. You know, sometimes in the Bible you read one thing, there's another thing, sort of, you know, you're not quite sure what it is, but throughout, it's definitively like unacceptable. Does that mean now, how do you reconcile those two things?
Okay, that is a bit anticipated, so I'll give a very brief answer. The brief answer to that is that I don't think you can literally take phrases from the Bible to apply to the modern homosexual condition, because the Bible, and indeed no society until fairly recent ones, has actually had to reckon with what we call now homosexual orientation. What the Bible, I'll talk about it in more detail what the Bible says, and I will go into that. I don't think it implies that he approves of homosexual activity. I mean, he hasn't spoken about that. But I think probably what he would argue would be that if certain people have a lifelong homosexual orientation and choose to settle down with one partner, that is better than living a promiscuous life, and it's better to. There's no reason why the church should oppose the civil recognition of a lifelong partnership. It doesn't imply that whatever may be done within that partnership is good. I think that would be his reasoning, but I'll talk about it more in 2 weeks' time. You're right, yes. Sarah?
Thank you, Funky. What I really enjoyed about your talk was sort of seeing how the Holy Spirit has laid the path for helping us understand the deposit of faith in different ways. It was really, really interesting to see that long view. Thank you for that. And sort of seeing Pope Francis making it more accessible to more people in a way. But my question is, I was just wondering about the difference between teaching and doctrine. Could you tell us a little bit about that? Are there teachings of the church that can evolve, say in the way that you're talking about with next week and the week after, I don't know what, other things that are called doctrines of the faith, the things that you must believe, otherwise you're not a Catholic or not a Christian even. But I suppose you were articulating a sense that some people are anxious that the Pope might become a heretic, if that could be possible.
Yes.
How would you explain to us a bit about the difference between, if there is one, teaching, that just needs to be explained and can evolve a bit, and doctrines where we just without this, it's over. Sort of thing.
I'm not sure. The word teaching, the word doctrine, essentially mean the same thing, because doctrine simply comes from a Latin word meaning to teach. What you may be hinting at, I'm not sure, is the relationship between what we call dogmatic theology and moral theology. Is that in other words, what we believe about God and the nature of reality?
Yes. How
how does that affect how we should behave?
Yes.
For a Catholic, those two are intrinsically connected.
Right.
If reality is of a certain nature, then we should behave in a certain way. In other words, if God is, if there is a God, well, yes, I suppose that's the sort of key thing, isn't it? As someone has said, if there is no God, then anything is possible. If there is no God, you basically can do what you like, because there is no reality really to base your. But if there is a God who has revealed himself, then certain things follow about how you should behave. Specifically within the Christian understanding, the Catholic understanding, the nature of God points to certain teachings about marriage, particularly because both in the Old Testament and the New Testament we find a very strong link drawn between God's faithful relationship with his people, his covenant with his people, is compared to a marriage.
Right.
Therefore, for example, faithfulness in marriage is somehow connected for a Christian with our understanding of who God is.
Right.
You can't really untie this connection. I'll talk a bit more about moral theology in general in my second or third talk, but basically our understanding of moral theology today, I would say, the sort of cutting edge of Catholic moral theology, is to see it not so much as obedience to rules and laws and commandments, though those have their place, but it's a return to the teaching of the Bible, of Jesus himself and the theologians of the church, roughly speaking, of the first 1,000 years, who saw the moral life as basically a search for happiness. As indeed Jesus begins his Sermon on the Mount, he begins it with an instruction as to who is happy. Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who are merciful, etc., etc. The very first psalm begins with a description of happiness. Blessed is the man who does not follow the way of the wicked, but meditates on the law of the Lord. The moral life, in other words, is a search for happiness, but what is happiness? It has to be distinguished from temporary pleasure. Happiness and pleasure or comfort are not quite the same thing. We have to find out, in other words, by knowing the nature of reality, of God and of what human life is, we have to discover who we are, what we're destined for, what kind of behaviour therefore will make us happy, truly happy, not just in this life, but for all eternity. And it's only Jesus who reveals that to us. Now it's within that kind of broad context. Rules and commandments, according to St. Thomas Aquinas, are an expression of the wisdom of the lawgiver. They're not so much things which form the absolute sort of foundation of your moral life. They're important because they express the wisdom of God, who knows we need guidance and rules to keep us on the right path, particularly as sinful and limited creatures. Therefore, when we start looking at sexuality within the context of that, we have to put it in the context of our ultimate destiny, which is to be united with God. That is what we'll achieve. That is what gives us, both in this life and in the life to come, true and lasting happiness. So what kind of sexual behaviour leads to happiness? That is the question we have to look at.
Yes.
And then if you're looking at the question of divorced and remarried people, you have to look at if you're talking about people who have a lifelong homosexual orientation, what kind of behaviour leads them to true, deep happiness?
Freedom.
The freedom, yes. Because if you simply, the modern world tends to think that freedom means the license to do what you want sexually, and that will bring you happiness, which of course it doesn't. It in fact enslaves you, because sexuality becomes then a kind of a god, as it is for many people, or a demon if you want.
And it does seem that Pope Francis's emphasis has come to the church because if you're wounded, you'll be healed. I think that's the thing that strikes me the most, the field hospital image, I think.
Yes, very much so.
You can only be healed by someone who knows.
Well, he doesn't want to change the church's sexual teaching, but he wants to say to people, before you even get beyond this barrier that you see of the church's very moralistic attitude, and realise that we are offering you good news. He wants to emphasise the good news, bring people to the church, where they will then gradually enter the fullness of life, in which there are certain consequences in your sexual behaviour. The French, or no, the French in general, but certainly a priest I remember speaking, giving a retreat, a French priest, put it very pithily when he said, "La mystique avant la morale." We need to offer people mysticism before morality. It doesn't mean that morality isn't important. If you offer them mysticism, in other words, if you offer them a path to find a true personal relationship with God, then the church's moral teaching will begin to make sense. If what they see first of all is a church that says, no, you can't do that, no, you can't, and no, you certainly can't do that.
Forget about that.
Forget about that. That's a bit odd, but not really, no, and it's all mortal sin. If that's how the church comes across to people, then the good news is being obscured. That's I think what he's saying. Yeah.
Yeah. So does that mean that the church needs to reevaluate its idea of sin?
No, I think it's a question of the church reevaluating its strategy. I think Francis has a very strong sense of sin. He lives an extremely austere life, and always has done. I think he wants the church to reevaluate its strategy, not its doctrine on sin.
But at the moment, that isn't the church, because the church doesn't doesn't tell people not to come to church. It allows people to come in. It's almost like the parable you said about the lady who was going to be stoned, because all the Pharisees, they say, well, because she committed a sin against the law, and adultery, that was to be stoned, so she had to be stoned. And then Christ said, well, that person who is without sin cast the first stone. And obviously they all threw it down and left. But then Christ said to the lady, who are your accusers? Where are your accusers now? And she couldn't find anyone. And said, well, I don't accuse you. But he also added, don't sin again.
Sure.
So really, I thought that's where the church was. I didn't realise the church was saying something else.
I think Pope Francis is trying to put himself, I suppose again it's part of trying to put yourself in the mind of the people on the edges of the world, if you like. What he's saying is, how do we look to the people out there? We look rather more like the elder son in the parable rather than the father.
You know, I think that we're all sinners, you know, like, even a fault can be a sin. If you worry, that's a sin. You know, I think the world is kind of cursed in a way, because, and we as Christians, we're fighting the battle every day because we try not to sin. You know, if I worry, that's classed as a sin. If I think something bad about somebody, you know, that's classed as a sin. So, you know, it's about, I don't know, your relationship, as you're saying. What is your relationship with God?
Yeah.
How do you trust in God? You know, how do you know what He is like and what He's like to you? Because I think that all the church inside of us, really, and together we are the church as well.
This, I think, is why the teaching on mercy is so important. Whether you take it in Cardinal Casper's line, his book on mercy, or whether you take the divine mercy, the word mercy. We have we talk about God's love, but love can mean so many different things. It can have a very feeble, it can be sort of, a very tolerant kind of, it doesn't matter kind of love. The word mercy implies the recognition of sin, but the word mercy and the word misery are related. It implies that sin is there, but God sees the sin, but is so full of love that His mercy is so overwhelming that the sin is kind of forgotten as soon as it's confessed.
Because if you look at all the disciples individually, they were all sinners.
Yeah.
All of them completely, especially Paul, who was killing how many thousands of people before he became a disciple. And then whilst he was a disciple, he was still struggling to be good.
You've got it.
Yeah.
I think my point on sin was the fact that, sorry, it wasn't the sort of the sort of addictive side, but it was more the part whereby sin is like something that tells you that. I think at the end, the whole point of being aware of sin is so that you don't kill yourself, because that's at the end that's what sin does. It makes you destroy yourself.
Sure.
And it's being aware of that more than being sort of caught in some sort of,
Okay, I think it was maybe one or two more questions, and then maybe it's time to wrap up. Did you have a question?
Yeah, thanks. You talked a bit about Pope Francis' relationship or interactions with the press, and I work with quite a few journalists and press representatives, and most of them are not Christian at all, and there does seem to be a bit of a perception that Pope Francis is installed to win over the press and undo mishaps of the last 10 years. That's an opinion that often gets shared with me. And I wondered if you had any opinion or insight into gestures that have been made known to the press, and whether that is kind of completely, is it just part of his personality in the way that he wants to be Pope, or is there some kind of media strategy in terms of the way he is presenting the Catholic Church to the world?
I think, going back to your first point, I think was he installed to, you said, to win over the media?
That's not my opinion, it's just something
I think there was a widespread perception among the cardinals that the church had got into a fairly bad place, that a combination of things, the child abuse scandal, corruption in the Vatican, the leaks in the Vatican, the financial ambiguities in the way the Vatican Bank was being run, certain signs that Pope Benedict wasn't really in control, that he was getting very ill. I think there was a sense that the image of the church was really suffering through this, and that they wanted someone vigorous who would also inspire confidence. Now, Bergoglio was a surprise choice precisely because he had kept a very low profile. In Argentina, he very much shunned the press. Not, I think, out of fear. It's hard to say exactly why. He may have simply, I think he's a shy person. It's hard to believe that, but I think deep down he is quite a shy person. He's a very austere person. He's a very, very simple lifestyle. Wonderful stories in the book about, someone giving him a massage or something, some therapist he was advised to go to. And when he took his clothes off, the pullovers and the shirts were all full of holes, and certainly when I think in the conclave he washed his own clothes and left them up to dry on the radiator. A man of great simplicity and austerity. So I don't think he had any interest in the press in Argentina. And he may well have felt the situation in Argentina seems to be so complex, so shifting, so dangerous, although people obviously were being killed, that he may well have felt that it was simply wiser to just not to speak to the press. Since he's become Pope, he seems to become an absolute master of the... I don't know this is by design, because he's certainly not that the Vatican themselves have any highly professional press office. I mean, they're not amateur, but they're not... Pope John Paul's press officer, what's his name, Navarro Valls was a real expert, but the present guy, Federico Lombardi, is not exactly a whiz-kid in terms of... I don't know, he just seems to have after all these years, having emerged from this silence, he seems to have a very natural ability just to speak to the press. I think he's not afraid, you see. I think again, it's part of this thing of lifting all sorts of taboos. There were certain questions you would never ask the Pope on a flight. Any press interview was very carefully controlled, and there was a sense of, well, you don't ask that, or you don't do it. It's 20 minutes and that's it, then off you go. He seems to sort of talk to them like he would to his friends, and ask what you like, and occasionally it has slightly negative results in that he says things that might be slightly sound a bit odd, but on the whole it seems to have worked very well.
You mean like he would punch the chap who spoke about his mother?
I have to admit, I've been thinking that because. Well, I mean, this is taking us into a different area, but the whole Charlie Hebdo thing reminded me of when I was Episcopal Vicar in the East End of London, and people would tell me of the fights that broke out in the school playground. For boys in those sort of single-sex schools, they had this sort of horrible habit of going up to each other, and all they would say is, they'd look another kid in the eye and say, "Your mother," and it means... Basically, your mother's a whore or something. And of course, a fight would immediately break out. And I thought, that's what the Charlie Hebdo thing is. Someone's gone up to the Muslims and said, "Your mother." And they've hit them. It doesn't mean you're right to fight back. Of course it doesn't mean that. But I couldn't help thinking there was a lot of folk wisdom in what the Pope said.
Yeah.
But very easily misinterpreted, of course,
Yeah.
as it has been. And it doesn't in any sense justify, of course, violence, but it's almost like saying that if you relentlessly mock someone else's belief, you're like lighting a fire in a dry forest, really. You can't tell what will happen. I think that's what he meant.
I think in terms of his sort of being a presence, I think because he's able to put things simply, and the media, the secular media like that, and people say, oh, he's a very simple Pope. I mean, he's a simple Pope with a doctorate from a German university, but because the phrases can be carried in the media or made into a headline, because he uses stories a lot, you know, when I was in Argentina, my grandmother used to say, you know, this sort of thing. And people who aren't regular churchgoers can relate to that better than, you know, something phrased in the language of the church or the language of academia.
One of the things people don't realise about him, I think, is that he spent a lot of time reading classical literature. I say classical, I mean the classics. One of his favourite books is I Promessi Sposi by Manzoni, the kind of Italian national novel. And he's read and knows by heart, you know, some of the Argentinian and Spanish classics. And he's actually said on one occasion, I try to say something in a way that it's not been said before. If I think of something and a phrase comes into my mind that I know has been said, it's been put that, I try to put it in a different way, drawing on, you know, and there's actually a lot of depth to the things he says. They're very unusual in that they're sound bites, but they're sound bites with bite, if you excuse the pun. They're sound bites with a depth to them. And I think it's partly his reading, is a kind of a literary talent that he has, really. And they, you know, there are phrases that stay in the mind. They're beautiful, they're arresting. And he seems to have a lot of them, you know. They're not,
Did he teach literature, Paul?
he has taught literature. Yeah, I mean, he trained as a chemist, I think, but he was put to work in a Jesuit, typical Jesuits, you know, if you're a chemist, you'll end up teaching literature. Like the English Foreign Office, you know, if you had a degree in Chinese, you'd be sent to Iraq or somewhere. We've got to draw to a close. Last question, yes.
I was just really just to say that, you know, maybe it's part of the fear of not, he's not afraid of a good argument, like a good Latin. You know, sort of a good Latin family will have a good old row, and that won't be a problem. You know, so it's nice to see that spirit of...
Yeah, he says he's gone on record as saying to, you know, couples, have a good argument, have a fight, throw things at each other, but make sure before you go to bed you make peace. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Hope to see lots of you next week.
Can we just thank Father Keith?